When Amelie's little boy, Sifo, died without warning, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and the only thing keeping her together was the hope that her family in Lagos would stand by her. She dialed her mother with shaking hands, desperate for comfort, desperate for someone to say, "We are coming." But instead, her mother's voice was flat and sharp, "We already booked Jamaica. We need this vacation more than you need our tears." The words cut deeper than the loss itself. Amelie froze, clutching the phone, her heart breaking in two. She replayed those words again and again, unable to believe her own mother could choose cocktails and beaches over her grandson's coffin. In that moment, Amelie realized she was truly alone. The house was quiet, Sifo's toys still scattered across the floor, his laughter still echoing in her memory, and yet there was no one to hold her, no one to cry with her. The grief was unbearable, but the betrayal was worse. She thought family meant love, loyalty, and presence, especially in the darkest hour. Instead, she was left with silence and the cruel reminder that sometimes the people you expect to care the most can wound you the deepest. And so, with her heart shattered and her faith in family broken, Amelie faced the unthinkable loss not only of her child but of the people she thought would never leave her side. The morning of Sifo's funeral was heavy and still, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Amelie dressed slowly, her hands trembling as she buttoned her black dress. Every movement felt unreal, as if she was watching someone else prepare to bury their child. She kept telling herself her family would come. She imagined seeing her mother, her father, her brothers, and sisters take their seats, holding her hand, standing with her in the moment she needed them most. But when she stepped outside and walked toward the small gathering of neighbors who had come to honor Sifo, the chairs reserved for her family sat empty, the space glaring at her like an open wound. The neighbors sang hymns, their voices trembling with compassion, and women she barely knew squeezed her shoulders, whispering words of comfort. They filled the air with love and kindness, but in Amelie's heart there was only a deep, echoing hollowness where her family should have been. As the pastor prayed, Amelie's phone buzzed in her hand. She thought for a brief second that maybe it was her family calling, maybe they had changed their minds, maybe they were on their way. But when she unlocked the screen, her chest tightened. There were photos, bright and loud, of her siblings on a Jamaican beach, holding cocktails, grinning at the camera as if the world was theirs. Selfies with sunglasses, toes buried in white sand, drinks raised in celebration. Amelie's eyes blurred as she stared at those images, unable to understand how the same blood that ran in her veins could belong to people who could smile while her child was being lowered into the earth. She felt the sting of betrayal mixing with her grief until it was unbearable. She couldn't cry out, couldn't scream, she just stood frozen as neighbors wiped their own tears for her. The sound of dirt hitting Sifo's tiny coffin rang louder than the songs, louder than the prayers, louder than her own heartbeat. Amelie wanted her family's hands to hold her up, but all she had was a phone filled with pictures of people who chose a beach over her pain. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just burying her son, she was burying the last hope that her family would ever truly be there for her. As the service ended, neighbors lingered, offering food, prayers, and their company, refusing to let her stand in her sorrow alone. And yet, despite their kindness, the image of those empty chairs burned in her mind. The world saw a grieving mother, but Amelie felt something deeper. She felt abandoned, discarded, left to face the darkest day of her life while her own bloodline laughed under the sun thousands of miles away. She held on to Sifo's memory tightly that day, because it was the only thing she had left that was real, while the family she thought she could count on had already shown her where their hearts truly were. The days after Sifo's funeral felt like walking through a fog. Amelie would wake up and for a moment forget, then reality would crash back in, heavier each time. The house was too quiet, the toys too still, the laughter gone. She thought maybe her phone would ring, maybe her mother or father would finally call to ask how she was holding up, maybe a message of comfort would appear. But the phone stayed silent. No calls, no prayers, no flowers. Nothing. The silence was so loud it swallowed her whole. It screamed at her that her family had chosen to erase her pain, to act as if her loss didn't matter. Each hour that passed without a word from them felt like another knife twisting inside her chest. She tried to convince herself they were busy, that maybe they didn't know what to say. But the truth was too clear, they simply didn't care enough to show up, not even in the smallest way. Her neighbors, people who owed her nothing, had prayed with her, brought her food, checked in on her. Strangers had held her hand, yet the very people who were supposed to love her unconditionally stayed silent. That silence cut deeper than any words could. It was not just absence, it was betrayal. Amelie felt her grief shift slowly into rage, though she kept it hidden deep inside. She didn't scream at her family or demand an explanation. She didn't write long messages or beg them to see her pain. She said nothing at all. Instead, she carried her anger like a burning coal pressed against her chest, letting it remind her of the truth: she could not count on them, not even when her world was falling apart. When she stood by Sipho's grave one evening, looking at the small mound of earth that now held everything she loved, she realized she had buried more than just her little boy. She had buried every last shred of trust she once had in her parents and siblings. She could no longer picture them as her safety net, her home, or her anchor. That illusion had died the same day her son did. The bond that tied her to them had been cut, not by her choice, but by their silence. In her heart, something hardened. She understood now that blood alone does not make people family. Love does. Loyalty does. Presence does. And they had shown her none of that. Their silence was not empty, it was full of meaning. It told her she wasn't worth their time, their prayers, or their love. That knowledge burned her, but it also set her free. For the first time, Amelie saw her family clearly, and what she saw was nothing she wanted to hold on to anymore. The betrayal hurt, but it also opened her eyes, and she promised herself she would never let their silence define her again. When her family finally returned from their vacation, Amelie thought maybe things would be different. Maybe they would come to her house with flowers or even a simple "we're sorry." Maybe they would look her in the eyes and finally admit that they had failed her when she needed them most. But instead, they came back full of stories about beaches, cocktails, and sunsets, as if nothing had happened. They laughed loudly in the living room, their voices filling the air that still felt heavy with Sipho's absence. Amelie sat quietly at the dinner table, her heart beating slower with every word they said, because none of those words were about her son. Nobody mentioned Sipho's name, nobody asked how she was coping, nobody even seemed to remember that just days before, she had buried her child. Her mother served food and cracked jokes, and her siblings laughed like children. Amelie forced herself to stay, but each moment at that table felt like a blade pressing deeper into her heart. Then, between bites of food, her mother looked at her with a smile and said, "You'll have more children. Don't dwell on the past." The words dropped like a bomb. Amelie froze. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sentence spun in her head over and over again. How could her own mother talk about Sipho like he was nothing more than a replaceable toy? Amelie pushed her chair back quietly. She excused herself, though her voice cracked as she spoke. She walked out of the dining room and into the night air, and in that moment something inside her broke. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was something sharper, something that rose from deep inside her chest and made her feel like she would never look at them the same way again. Her hands trembled, but her mind was clear. She could not stay tied to people who could laugh through her pain, who could look at her shattered heart and tell her to simply move on. Standing outside, she looked up at the sky, and for the first time, she let herself accept the truth she had been avoiding. She had lost her son, but she had also lost her family, and the two losses together were too heavy to carry. The difference was that she could not bring Sipho back, but she could decide whether to let her family continue to wound her. That night, she felt the last thread of connection snap. It was painful, but it was also freeing. She knew she would never beg them for love again, never sit at that table again pretending things were fine. Something had ended forever, and in that ending, Amelie began to take her first step toward reclaiming her life. Amelie woke up the next morning with her mind made up. She had spent too many nights waiting for calls that never came, holding on to hope that only tore her apart even more. She realized her family was never going to change, and if she stayed close to them, they would keep reopening wounds that were already bleeding. So she took her phone, sat on her bed, and began blocking every number one by one. Her mother's, her father's, her siblings. Every email, every social media account. It felt final, but also strangely peaceful. For the first time in months, she was no longer waiting for them. She was no longer giving them the power to hurt her again. When her family came knocking, she didn't open the door. When they left messages at her gate, she threw them away. When they tried to pretend things were normal, she refused to answer. She owed them nothing. What they called family had shown itself to be nothing but cruelty dressed up as love, and Amelie would no longer make excuses for it. She was tired of forgiving people who didn't care if she bled. She went to Sipho's room and carefully packed away his toys, folding his little clothes, placing his shoes gently into a box. Every piece carried a memory, every object carried his laughter. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't just tears of pain, they were tears of release. She whispered to him as if he could still hear her, promising that she would find peace, that she would build a life where his memory would be safe, away from people who disrespected his existence. With only a few bags, Amelie left Lagos behind and moved to a small town in Ghana where no one knew her story. The streets were unfamiliar, the faces were new, but that was exactly what she wanted. No whispers, no pitying stares, no judgment. She could breathe again. She could walk down the road without feeling like a wound being stared at. She started fresh, building a quiet life where she was not the woman whose family abandoned her, but simply Amelie. In that new town, she found peace in the silence she created. It was not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of freedom. No buzzing phone filled with selfish words, no family visits dripping with false concern. Just her memories of Sipho, and the slow but steady healing of her soul. For the first time in her life, she felt free, free from their coldness, free from their cruelty, free from the chains of a family that never acted like one. And though she carried scars, she also carried a strength she never knew she had. This time, Amelie chose herself, and in that choice, she found the beginning of her freedom. Amelie never sent a message, never made a call, never explained herself. She didn't need to. Her silence became her answer. Her family had expected her to cry, to fight, to come knocking on their door begging for love, but she gave them nothing. No words, no visits, not even anger. She simply disappeared from their lives, and that absence hurt more than any confrontation ever could. At first, they told themselves it was temporary. They thought she just needed space and that she would come back when she was ready. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Amelie remained gone. On holidays, her family would gather around tables and post pictures online with captions about love and unity. They smiled into cameras, plates of food laid out, arms around each other as if their family was whole. But Amelie's silence sat in the background like a ghost, a reminder of the daughter, sister, and mother they had abandoned. They expected her to see those photos, to feel left out, to miss them enough to return. Instead, she looked at those images with steady eyes and scrolled past without a word. Their version of togetherness no longer had power over her. Her silence became a wall they couldn't break down. Each unanswered call, each ignored message, each unopened letter told them more than words ever could: she was done. At first, they grew angry. They accused her of being dramatic, of trying to punish them. But deep down, they knew the truth. They had pushed her away with their selfishness and cruelty, and now they were living with the consequences. Amelie found strength in staying quiet. It was not the silence of weakness, but of power. She didn't need to explain why she left, because their own actions were the explanation. She didn't need to shout, because their guilt did the shouting for her. Every time they posted their smiling faces, every time they tried to prove to the world they were a happy family, her absence told the real story. People noticed. Neighbors whispered. Friends asked questions. And the family that had once dismissed her now had to live with the shadow of her silence. But for Amelie, it wasn't about revenge. It was about peace. For the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be free from constant disappointment. She no longer waited for love that never came, no longer begged for support that was never given. She poured her energy into building a quiet life where Saifo's memory was honored, not ignored. Her silence was not emptiness, it was healing. It was her way of choosing herself over people who had chosen to abandon her. And while her family waited for her to crawl back, she never did. She knew that going back would mean losing herself again, and she had finally learned that her peace was worth more than their approval. Months passed, and Amelie built her life in silence, far away from the noise of her past. She had not heard a word from her family that wasn't filtered through blocked numbers and ignored messages. She thought the distance would keep them away for good, but one afternoon there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she froze. Standing there was her father, a man who had not come to his grandson's funeral, a man who had left her to cry alone. But this time, his face was different. The pride that always covered him was gone. His shoulders slumped, his eyes were heavy, and his voice shook as he said her name. Amelie didn't move aside. She waited, her heart calm but cold. He began to explain that the family business was collapsing. Debts were piling up, creditors were circling, and everything he had worked for was falling apart. For the first time in his life, he sounded desperate. He told her that they needed her help, that she was the only one who could save them. He spoke quickly, almost begging, his voice breaking in ways Amelie had never heard before. She listened without saying a word, her mind traveling back to the morning of Saifo's funeral, the empty chairs, the photos of her siblings holding cocktails on a beach while she lowered her son into the ground. She remembered her mother's voice telling her not to dwell on the past, as if Saifo's life had been nothing. She remembered every unanswered call, every day of silence. And now here was her father, at her door, asking for help as if none of it had happened. Amelie finally looked him straight in the eyes, her voice steady but sharp. "You picked cocktails over coffins," she said softly. "You picked beaches over blood. You don't get to pick me now." Her father's mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. He knew she was right. He had nothing to give her, no apology big enough to heal the wounds they had carved into her. Slowly, she closed the door. She didn't slam it. She didn't shout. She just closed it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through her grief. On the other side, her father stood alone, facing the consequences of choices that could never be undone. Inside, Amelie leaned against the door and let out a long breath. For the first time, she felt no guilt. She had given her family chance after chance, and they had chosen themselves every time. Now, she was choosing herself. That knock on her door reminded her of one powerful truth: people who abandon you in your darkest hour don't deserve you in their hour of need. And Amelie knew she would never again let their desperation become her burden. In her new town, Amelie slowly began to breathe again. At first, the silence felt heavy, but soon it became a space for healing. She met neighbors who brought her food not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She met women who sat with her in the evenings, listening to her stories about Saifo, wiping her tears without judgment. Men in the community helped her fix small things around the house, showing up with kindness where her own brothers had shown absence. Little by little, these people became her circle, not out of duty or obligation, but out of pure love. On Saifo's birthday, they lit candles with her and whispered prayers for his soul. On hard days, they left flowers at her door, reminding her that she was not alone. These gestures, small but full of heart, meant more to her than anything her blood relatives had ever done. In their warmth, Amelie realized something she had never understood before. Family is not always the people who share your blood, but the ones who choose to stand with you when your heart is bleeding. Her circle was small, but it was strong. These new bonds were built on respect, loyalty, and love, the very things she had begged from her own family and never received. With them, she no longer felt abandoned. With them, Sipho's memory was alive and honored. Amelie had lost so much, but in the ashes of her pain, she discovered a new kind of family, one she could finally trust. And that truth gave her peace.